The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clarke, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member Tonko. I thank our panelists for being here to testify for us today. And while I'm glad that this subcommittee is considering the importance of power plant emissions to ensure our constituents have clean air to breathe, I reject the premise of the hearing, that we cannot set our nation on a path to decarbonize the power sector without having reliable and low-cost electricity. The state of New York is a clear counterexample to the false Republican narrative. Our state passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019 and is now well on its way to achieving 70% renewable energy by 2030 without significant reliability concerns. If Republicans were serious about their concerns with reliability, they would commit to working with Democrats to modernize our nation's transmission infrastructure, which would immediately improve reliability and resiliency against extreme weather events and lower energy costs. My first question is to Mr. Duffy. In your testimony, you called the EPA's current proposal a reasonable approach in line with the power sector's trends, but note that it should be strengthened. I agree with the assessment. I was disappointed to see the proposal lack action toward peaker power plants, which in New York represent more than 50 fossil fuel power plants. Many of these have been operating since the 1970s or earlier and have little or no pollution control equipment to reduce emissions and are located almost exclusively in environmentally overburdened communities of color. In what ways can this rule be strengthened, especially with regard to the nation's dirtiest power plants, and in ways to protect the most vulnerable communities from overlapping sources of pollution?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So there are two things that, it's early days in reviewing this big proposal, but there are two things that come to mind as far as strengthening it. One is, as you mentioned, the coverage of the existing gas plants. So EPA has proposed to cover those that are bigger than 300 megawatts and that are operating more than 50% of the time. That covers just 7% of the existing natural gas fleet, less than 30% of their CO2 emissions. The EPA has asked for comment on down to 150 megawatts and 40% capacity factors. That would move us up to 44% of all units, covering almost 80% of emissions. So there's a really big swing that can happen there, and we've been looking at that. The second is on timelines. It makes a lot of sense to have longer timelines for big pollution control technology, construction like CCS, but for things like fuels and efficiencies, we're looking at whether that can be done on a shorter time frame.
Thank you. It's important that when policy prioritizes polluters over public health, it's our most vulnerable community members, seniors, pregnant women, children, who are hurt the most. Further handcuffing our economy to fossil fuels does nothing but trap our frontline communities in unhealthy environments, as communities of color are often the ones bearing a disproportionate share of the impacts from pollution and climate change. I mentioned earlier that New York has led the country in setting emissions reductions goals and making actionable plans to meet those goals. For example, New York's peaker rule is expected to retire over 1,600 megawatts of fossil fuel peaker power plants by 2025, setting the state on a path towards 70% renewable energy by 2030 and saving countless lives caused by environmental pollution. However, I know not every one of my colleagues is blessed to represent a state that has taken significant steps toward climate pollution reductions. Mr. Duffy, EPA's proposed rule included necessary flexibility to account for the different resources and meet states where they are. What flexibilities are available to states to comply with these standards, and does that flexibility account for the need for grid reliability and resiliency?
Yes. So the way the Clean Air Act works, EPA sets emission guidelines for existing sources. The states then write their own plans. Generally, they have to have the standards be equivalent to what EPA has proposed. They can go stronger. They can also consider the remaining useful life and other factors of these plants and have less stringent standards. EPA is also taking a lot of comments on how, whether or not trading and averaging and different types of compliance programs could be equivalent with EPA's emission guidelines. So there's a lot of flexibility for the states to engage with local communities, with the power plant owners, and design a plan that works for them.
Very well, thank you. I remain committed to ensuring my constituents have clean air to breathe and that we act with the urgency the climate crisis demands. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields